I bow for a reason. It's not that I'm confusing the end with the beginning. It's that you are the sovereign people. That used to mean something. You know that moment in the courtroom before proceedings start and the bench is empty and the people in the court are waiting, and then the door opens at the back and the tipstaff, or whatever he's called, walks out, and behind him the judge, and the tipstaff says, "All rise." And the judge comes out and he approximately jerks his head in the direction of the court, and the people with varying degrees of obsequiousness go, or. We have had this the wrong way around for a long time. The judge is supposed to bow to the people. And the fact that he doesn't means that we have lost a sense of what it is to be a republic. And we have also lost a sense of what it is to be a democracy, because there are many symptoms of a democracy, which is a different thing to a republic, related, but a different thing. It means more than putting a mark on a piece of paper every few years. It means to make our own laws, but it also means to be able to have the right to speak, to talk about our own laws. And this right is now diminishing rapidly in front of our eyes, because the elites, or as I call them, the E-listers, who run us, have decided that the people are an inconvenience. If they had their way, they would have an election to elect a new people. Democracy is a very profound thing. It has many, many qualities which we have lost. The quality of, for example, the meaning of justice. We talk now about equality, but let's talk about justice. And Thomas Aquinas, who defined justice, to give to each what is owed with a perpetual, constant will. That's all we need. To give to each what is owed with a perpetual, constant will. That definition of justice is not something that we can take for granted. It's not to be counted upon as something constant unless we nurture it and cultivate it and conserve it. And this is the meaning of that much maligned, demonized word, conservative, to conserve the protections and the institutions which are vital for our civilization and our freedoms. In my lifetime, I've watched all of these values come under constant attack. I've seen the press, a great historic institution that served as the fourth buttress of democracy, the fourth estate, turn rogue, and it has turned rogue, becoming as a wrecking ball, directed at everything in our inheritance of history and tradition and faith and family relationships, turning upon the people it was supposed to serve, and ipso facto upon their children and on their children's children. And that's why I quit journalism, Irish journalism, 3 years ago. Above all, Ireland is a nation. Pádraig Pearse, in his essay, The Spiritual Nation, spiritual. And he didn't say, by the way, in the modern straw man caricature, that it was an Irish Catholic tradition or an Irish Catholic and Gaelic tradition. His view of nationhood was based on that of Thomas Davis, who held that nationality was a spirituality, a power alive in the land, into which all of those who lived in that land could become connected. By Pearse's definition, this did not exclude anyone who wished to bear it allegiance, although this didn't mean the same as that the Irish nation is simply the postmodern sum of influences brought together in the population. The Irish nation was not confined to Gaelic Ireland, but Gaelic Ireland was its cornerstone. And Pearse said that while the last Gael survived, Ireland would continue to exist. But when the last Gael died, Ireland too would die. Meanwhile, he said, those who imagine some objection to this idea as arising from the presence of other nationalities did not understand the concept of nationhood at all. Nations are always being cross-fertilized from the riches of other cultures. This is what makes them great, and is what made Ireland great. Freedom, for Davis and for Pearse, amounted to no more and no less than the rights of man in Ireland. But this idea too has become perverted, and I want to return to it. Ireland now faces a future of being in the future none of the above. Not a nation, not a democracy, not a republic. It is no longer a nation except perhaps in the hearts of a minority of its people or its population. It is not a republic in anything but name, and it is not a democracy because it no longer even is capable of providing its citizens with the means of a proper and useful conversation or ensuring a shared culture of values and understandings. Nigel Farage asked us a question last night. How on earth did Ireland, having fought so hard and so long for its freedom, so easily, so lightly give it away again? It's a very good question, and there are many ways you could go about it. I don't have time to go into them, but fundamentally there are two, I believe. One is quite prosaic, the other is a little bit more profound. The prosaic one is simply economics, that because of the strange and awful circumstances in which we found our freedom, globally I mean, and the period through which the early years that freedom, so-called, prevailed, an idea took root in Ireland that in fact we were incapable of managing our own affairs. That the objective circumstances seemed to dictate always that we were always to be dependent on some other outside force. And the other one was, of course, and related to that was the colonial legacy, the psychological legacy of dependency and self-hatred and self-doubt and fear and all of those things, which caused us to rush into the embrace again of another dependency. Let us never forget, though, that at the heart of our relationship with Europe is not a great affection. We have no affection for the EU. The EU is not Europe. We have an affection, or various affections, many affections for Europe, but the EU is not Europe, and never was. And our relationship with the EU was predominantly and solely to do with money. Because money was what allowed our leaders to run this country, because they had never any inkling of how to go about running it themselves. They depended on that money. They could not govern without that money. That's why we developed this so-called love affair with Europe, which the opinion polls still seem to bear out, but which I believe deeper down is not a love affair. It was an arranged marriage. And there was a moment in November 2011 when we realized this. You remember those dark days of November? We watched the Troika stalking the streets of Dublin, announcing their presence, announcing their power, the humiliation of that. And yet, it's like as if this happened a century ago. Today, we're back, as it were, on the pig's back, and none of it is even remembered. And that's the point I want to make, really. There's a real difficulty here about the idea of Irexit. I fully support the idea in principle, but look at us. Look at the kind of leaders we have. The kind of leaders we have are the people who were delivered to us by the relationship that we developed in Europe. They were second class, third class, fourth class, fifth class. Because only that kind of leader, or so-called leader, could possibly have the shamelessness to govern us in these circumstances. Yes, absolutely. There's a story about Henry Ford when he launched his production line, automatic production line in 1908 for the Model T Ford. Up to that point, the cars had been built individually by hand, by men, craftsmen, great craftsmen. But Frederick Taylor invented this system whereby the cars could be produced on a production line. And Henry Ford advertised for workers, men to man these production lines. And it's a very interesting statistic because he found very soon that there was an enormous attrition rate of workers. People were just walking off the line. Men were walking off the line. For every 100 men that he was able to persuade to stay on the line, do you know how many he had to get in the first place? 963 for every 100 men. And that is because those other 863 men were so metaphysically offended by the idea of screwing one nut on one bolt every hour of every day, every week, every month of the year, that they walked away. They would rather starve than do this. A similar principle applies to our quality of leadership in this state. The kind of people we need are there. They're there. They're out there at this moment. But they wouldn't touch this with a barge pole. They would not be dragged into a situation where they are no more than messenger boys, halt keepers of our new-fangled modern halt. So we're in the situation that even if we had a will immediately to release ourselves from this dependency, we don't have in place the kind of people who would lead us out of it. The only way these people know how to live as politicians, as statesmen so-called, as stateswomen so-called, as whatever they are, is by cultivating this dependency, by carrying messages back to us, by forcing us to accept what their paymasters tell them has to happen. And this has been happening consistently for many decades. It happened again after the 2011, where Enda Kenny promised the Irish people that he would stand up for them in Europe, and he went to Europe and he went on his knees. So we have a real problem. Yes, freedom is there, but our leadership stands between us and freedom. We have to remove them. And in order to remove them, we need to have a conversation, which means we have to remove the media because they will not permit us to have a conversation. And there is a further problem, another aspect that is really quite urgent. It is the disintegration of Europe itself. And I'm not talking purely about the disintegration of the EU, which is actually obvious, but because I said, Europe and EU are not coterminous entities, but in a certain sense they have converged. And unfortunately, the ideologies of the EU have so contaminated the well of European culture that now Europe is, for all intents and purposes, dependent for its future on what is available by way of leadership from the EU, just as we are dependent for our future on what is available to us by way of leadership in the EU and here. The European project has always been restricted by its essentially bureaucratic nature, which has treated culture as something irrelevant and unessential. The EU has no culture. I mean, this is a conflation that politicians in Ireland try to make all the time. They would talk about, if you said you were opposed to the EU, they'd say, well, are you not a European? Joyce, what about Joyce? Joyce was a great European writer. I said, yes, he was, but he wasn't an EU writer. And what evolved in the European Union was never articulate about itself in culture terms, but resort to a language of materialism and secular democracy. And it made the mistake of believing that a society can form itself willy-nilly out of a melting pot of ethnicities and cultures. Experience of such experiments demonstrate that without a strong and assertive host culture at the centre, the multicultural soup lacks any content for unity and so divides into a multiplicity of enclave entities. We can see this already in the Netherlands, in France, in the UK and other European countries, where immigrant populations attracted by prosperity and modernity converge for economic reasons only. They have no affinity or affection or allegiance to the country they end up in. And this is our fault. Because we don't demand it. This is our fault. It isn't their fault. And in the same way, you know, in a certain sense, all us countries in the EU, we're kind of like immigrants to the idea of the European Union. We come in hope and expectation. We arrived in expectation. But on arrival, we found that the core was vacated, a hole in the donut of the unity we anticipated. Douglas Murray, the British writer, has written a book called The Strange Death of Europe. It's well worth reading. He says, Europe is committing suicide, or at least its leaders have decided to commit suicide. That the civilization that we know as Europe is in the process of committing suicide, and that neither Britain nor any other Western country, European country, can avoid that fate because we all appear to suffer from the same symptoms and maladies. As a result, by the end of the lifespans of most people currently alive, Europe will not be Europe, and the peoples of Europe will have lost the only place in the world we had to call home. And he goes on, Europe today has little desire to reproduce itself, fight for itself, or even take its own side in an argument. He identifies two main causes for Europe's drastic situation. One is mass migration into Europe, which he says turned Europe from a home for the European peoples to a home for the entire world. The lack of integration and assimilation transformed innumerable places in Europe into places that were not in the least European, except in name. The normalization of mass immigration and the delusional expectation of integration have blinded us to the truth about what has been done. The second factor, he said, was the destruction by Europeans of their own beliefs, tradition, and legitimacy. Europe, he says, had forgotten that everything you love, even the greatest and most cultured civilizations in history, can be swept away by people who are unworthy of them. The myth of progress is used, he says, to blinker the people of Europe to the calamity unfolding in their midst. Europe is weighed down by guilt about its past. And there is also, he says, a problem in Europe of existential tiredness and a feeling that perhaps for Europe the story has run out and a new story must be allowed to begin. The core of Europe was its 2,000-year-old Christian civilization. And this is now under constant attack from the new ideologies of the EU, which attack the very fabric of Europe's culture in the manner of a metastatic cancer. The loss of this culture, says Murray, unifying stories, he called it. These are the Christian stories, the mythologies of our time, of our age, about our past and ideas about what to do with our present and future, would be a serious conundrum at any time. And this is the point. This is the answer to these people who talk about xenophobia. During a time, he says, of momentous societal change and upheaval, it is likely to prove fatal. The world is coming into Europe at a time when Europe has lost sight of what it is. And while the movement of millions of people from other cultures into a strong and assertive culture might have worked, the movement of millions of people into a guilty, jaded, and dying culture cannot. This is precisely the point that Pádraig Pearse was making. You need to build the host culture on its native elements, and then it becomes a safe place for outsiders and natives to coexist. And so, as Murray concludes, all of this is happening at a time when we are forbidden to even speak of such things. "25 years ago, at the time of the referendum on the Maastricht Treaty, I went around Ireland at that time with the late great Raymond Crotty. And that treaty, that treaty consolidated Ireland's dependency on the EU. I used to ask people why it was that the unity and self-realisation of a larger entity, like the European Union, was to be regarded as ipso facto good, whereas the self-realization of a smaller entity, like Ireland, was to be regarded as dangerous and wrong. Nobody has ever satisfactorily answered this question to me. Why is it that bigger is better? Even if it has no culture, it's still better. No unifying elements, no unifying methodologies, nothing to hold it together. And yet these people insist that we must follow their lead. And there is an alternative, a Europe of nation states. Ireland was briefly such, but for nearly 50 years, the very idea of Ireland as a nation state has been subjected to the cultural equivalent of carpet bombing. Every hour of every day, from every newspaper and every broadcasting station, the Irish people have been subjected to relentless propaganda concerning not merely the inevitability and singular correctness of the EU project, but of the invalidity and indeed moral dubiousness of the national idea. This has penetrated into every remaining crevice of public thinking. And yet the nation-state remains the most functional political entity because it is most likely to maintain a functional culture and therefore an effective community and an effective economy. It is the best means of political organisation for safeguarding borders and ensuring the security of citizens. The nation-state is the cradle of parliamentary democracy, of the rule of law rooted in a coherent concept of justice, of the notion of human rights rooted in the dignity of every human person, and of the market as the engine of social and economic cooperation. What we call Europe now was never a convincing prospect as a replacement for this, and yet we were led into it to be destroyed in the process. What we call Europe has attacked and all but destroyed the three fundamental pillars of human society: family, church, nation. All three have been subject to relentless attack for 5 decades, yet all three elements, family, church and nation, are capable of a resurgence at any moment, and the early signs are that this is already in train. Awoken by the encroaching totalitarianisms that have pushed just a little too far too fast, the people of the West are awakening for their slumber. A revolution is coming. It's beginning to happen all over the free world. It is not, I believe, a revolution of the right, or the alt-right, or the far right. It is a revolution from the concrete centre, from the places where actually existing working people live and love and work. It is a revolution fundamentally against bullshit and bullying. And it is also a rejection of intimidation and political correctness, which is, by the way, not some slightly kooky obsession with extravagant politeness, but a strategic tyranny of censorship designed not merely to stop people saying certain things, but even thinking certain things. We need to counteract this. We need to begin speaking against these tyrannies. We need to begin to say what we think, what we believe, and above all, what we demand, what we, the sovereign people, demand. We need a vision of self-sustenance into the distant future, which will replace our current dependencies, our current appalling, shameful, I believe, dependence on a 12.5% corporation tax. We need to phase this out in the medium to long term and replace it with our own self-generated economy built on traditions and beliefs and energies of Irish people. We have to demand, first of all, the right to a free conversation, unimpeded by false pieties or pseudo-civility. And we need that so as to discover and recruit to a project of patriotism some form of leadership, some band of leaders which respect the Irish nation, which respect the sovereign people of the Republic of Ireland and their democratic right to speak of that which matters to them and the future of their nation and their children and their children's children. a group of leaders which is capable of articulating a vision for a self-sufficient, confident Ireland of the future. Thank you very much.